The rain over Chicago that morning had the soft hush of a city pretending to behave. Inside the glass lobby of Harrington Logistics, polished floors reflected the cold light from the high windows, and the receptionist tapped a glossy nail against her keyboard. A man in a worn charcoal coat stepped through the revolving door, holding the small hand of a girl no older than 6. She clutched a stuffed rabbit with one stitched ear. The marble lobby went quiet for half a heartbeat, then erupted in soft laughter. A young executive nudged his friend and said loudly, "Security?" Who let the delivery guy walk into the executive floor? Corbin Shaw, the operations director, glanced at the man's scuffed boots and said in a flat voice, "The back door is for people like you." The little girl looked up at her father with wet eyes and asked, "Daddy, do they hate our clothes?" The man did not answer. In a few minutes, every person in that lobby would learn that he was the one who signed their paychecks. His name was Andrew Cole. He was 29 years old. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair cut close, and a face that looked like it had carried more weight than its years should allow. He did not stand like a man who owned anything. He stood like a man who had buried his wife 3 years earlier, who had taught himself to braid his daughter's hair after a long shift, who had learned that the world handed out cruelty more freely than kindness. His charcoal coat was clean, but faded along the cuffs. His shirt had been white once, before too many wash cycles softened it into something the color of old paper. His jeans were dark and plain, his boots cracked at the toes from honest use. He lived in a modest house on the western edge of Chicago, in a neighborhood where lawns were mowed by their owners and porch lights stayed on for neighbors who worked late. The house was small, neat, and warm. There was a framed photograph in the hallway of a young woman laughing on a beach, her hand cupped over a smaller hand. That was Sarah. She had been the heart of the house. A drunk driver had taken her on a Tuesday in March, and Andrew had folded his grief into the corners of the house so that his daughter would have room to grow up without drowning in it. Sarah had been the only daughter of a man named Walter Brennan, a long-haul driver who had spent 30 years behind the wheel for Harrington Logistics. When Sarah had been a teenager, Walter had broken his back in a delivery accident. The old Harrington, the founder himself, had paid for the surgery out of his own pocket and held the family job open for 9 months. Andrew had heard that story so many times over Sunday dinners that it had become part of the floorboards of his own life. To him, Harrington was not a logo on a truck. It was the company that had carried his wife's family when no one else would. 3 years before that rainy morning, the old Harrington had died. His heirs sold pieces of the company to anyone with cash. Vultures circled. Some investors wanted to gut the warehouses, sell the trucks for scrap, and walk away with whatever was left. Andrew had quietly used the savings he and Sarah had built, plus a substantial inheritance from her grandmother's farm in Indiana, plus loans from a small group of patient partners. Year by year, paper by paper, he had become the controlling shareholder of Harrington Logistics. He never asked for a title. He did not want a corner office. He wanted, more than anything, to make sure that the company that had once carried Walter Brennan home would still carry people like Walter Brennan when his daughter was grown. But something had been wrong for a long time. Anonymous letters had been arriving at his post office box. A driver had written, "We are running 15-hour shifts and the system error is the last 4. A warehouse worker had written, "They cut the family insurance and told us we chose the new plan ourselves." A junior accountant had sent a single sentence on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Look at the consulting fund. It does not consult anyone." Andrew had read every letter twice, and then placed it in a folder marked with Sarah's handwriting. He had not acted in anger. He understood that if he marched into the building as the owner, every guilty person would perform a clean version of themselves, and the truth would slip back into the floorboards. So he had chosen the slowest, surest weapon a man could carry. He chose to look ordinary. His daughter, Chloe Cole, was 6 years old and had her mother's curious eyes. She wore a soft blue jacket that was a little too big for her, the sleeves rolled at the wrists. Her hair was light brown and tied back gently with a yellow ribbon. In her arms she carried a stuffed rabbit with one ear sewn back on with mismatched thread. The rabbit had been her mother's gift, the very first thing Sarah had bought when she learned she was pregnant. Chloe had named it Button after the small black button her father had stitched on its chest to hide a hole. She rarely went anywhere without it. Chloe was a quiet child, the kind of child who watches before she speaks. She had inherited her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when something puzzled her. She had inherited her father's habit of standing still when other children would run. She did not ask much of the world. She asked only that her father come home each night, and that the lamp in the hallway be left on, so the dark would not feel so large. That morning the elementary school had called at 6:15. A water main had burst overnight, and classes were canceled. Andrew had no one else to call. Sarah's mother lived in Indiana now. The babysitter was at a funeral in Milwaukee. He had a single meeting to keep that day, one that he had been preparing for almost 2 years, and so he had knelt in front of his daughter at the kitchen table and asked her if she would like to ride along to Daddy's work. She had nodded solemnly and asked if she could bring Button. He had said yes. In the car, she had asked him why he was not wearing a suit if he was going to see important people. Andrew had thought for a moment, watching the wipers stroke the rain. Then he had said softly, "Sweetheart, if a person is only kind to you when you wear a suit, they were never really kind." Chloe had nodded as though that made perfect sense, and she had hummed quietly to her rabbit for the rest of the drive. The chief executive of Harrington Logistics was a woman named Astrid Morgan. She was 28 years old, with dark hazel hair that fell just past her shoulders, and the kind of bearing that made meetings finish on time. That morning she wore a navy dress, modest in cut and elegant in fit, the kind that ended a polite distance below the knee, paired with a slim silver watch her grandmother had given her on graduation day. She had been promoted into the chief role 2 years earlier, during a crisis that had nearly buried the company. The board had wanted someone fast, ruthless, and presentable. She had been all three. Astrid was not cruel. She was bright, decisive, and tired. She believed in numbers because numbers had saved the company, or so the reports kept telling her. The operations side had been a wound when she arrived, bleeding cash, losing clients. Corbin Shaw had walked in and bandaged it. Margins climbed. Hospital contracts returned. The board stopped calling at midnight. In her mind, Corbin was a hard man who got hard results, and that was the price of survival. She had never visited the warehouses without an escort. She had never eaten lunch in the break room with the drivers. She had read every quarterly report as if it were the truth. She did not know that the truth had been edited line by line before it ever crossed her desk. That morning she had been on her way to the executive floor when she heard laughter in the lobby. She paused at the elevator. Through the glass wall she saw a man in a worn coat holding a small child's hand. She saw Corbin Shaw step into the man's path. She did not yet know who the man was, and so she did what she had been trained to do. She straightened her posture, told herself it was probably nothing, and pressed the call button. But something in the child's face, something open and afraid, made her hesitate. She did not laugh. She frowned, and the elevator doors did not open quickly enough. Corbin Shaw was 42 years old and dressed like a man who believed his suit was an argument. His charcoal jacket was tailored close to his shoulders. His shoes were polished hard enough to throw the chandelier back at the chandelier. He wore a steel watch on a leather strap, and an expression that suggested the watch was the cheapest thing he was wearing. He had been at Harrington for 9 years, climbing through the operations branch by stepping on every back that did not move out of the way. He called warehouse workers labor units. He called drivers operating assets. He called cutting health insurance benefit optimization. He had built a small court of mid-level managers who echoed every word he said. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had never been corrected, that respect followed the cut of a coat. He believed that a person who wore old boots had old ideas. He believed that the company's pain came from spending on people who could not raise their voices. 2 months earlier, he had ordered a senior warehouse worker, a man of 61 named Otis Dawson, out of the executive elevator because, in Corbin's words, that elevator was for clients and operations leadership. Otis had been a Harrington driver for 38 years. He had said nothing. He had walked down 23 flights of stairs. That kind of silence was the soil Corbin grew in. So when Corbin came around the corner that rainy morning, escorting two prospective clients toward the conference suite, and saw a man in a charcoal coat standing in the middle of his polished lobby with a child in tow. He did not check the visitor log. He did not ask the receptionist. He saw worn boots and a stuffed rabbit, and he made the decision that would, in roughly 40 minutes, end his career. He stepped forward and said, loud enough that the prospective clients could hear his command in his voice, "Sir, the service entrance is on the east side of the building. This floor is for executives and clients." Andrew turned his head slowly. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Is the back door always the answer for people who wear old coats?" Corbin gave a thin smile. "Only for people who do not understand which floor they belong on." A handful of young employees, sensing entertainment, drifted closer. One of them lifted a phone as if to capture the moment for friends who would never see it. Chloe pressed against her father's leg. She had been called many names in the playground, but never had she heard adults speak to her father this way. She looked up at him and tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "if we wear new clothes tomorrow, will they stop laughing?" The question went into Andrew's chest like a small, clean knife. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the laughter, ignoring Corbin, ignoring the receptionist who had finally found the courage to look at him with concern. He took both his daughter's hands in his own. "No, sweetheart," he said. "Good people do not need new clothes to treat someone kindly." Chloe nodded uncertainly. Behind him, Corbin laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. "Touching," Corbin said. "But this is a logistics company, not a daycare." Andrew rose to his full height. He looked at Corbin the way a carpenter looks at a beam that is no longer load-bearing. "Then today," he said quietly, "this company is going to learn its first lesson again." The lobby went still in a way that lobbies almost never do. Andrew did not raise his voice. He did not draw a card or a phone or anything from his pocket. He simply stood there with one hand on his daughter's shoulder and let the room continue to speak for itself. The young employee with the phone smirked and whispered something to his friend. The senior manager nodded along with Corbin, eager to be on the right side of the moment. The receptionist looked at the visitor logbook and looked back up, her brow tight with confusion. A janitor across the lobby stopped pushing his cart and watched, his face unreadable. Two warehouse supervisors at the glass doors looked in from the loading bay, and Andrew saw in their eyes a tiredness that was older than the building. They had seen this before. They had been on the receiving end of it. He watched all of them. He counted them in his head, gently, the way a teacher counts children before crossing a street. He was not gathering enemies. He was gathering data. He noticed which managers laughed loudest, which ones laughed quietly so they could deny it later, which ones tried to step away without seeming to. He noticed which security guard had moved one step closer to him, as if to ask the right question if anyone would let him. He noticed Astrid Morgan at the elevator bank, the frown deepening on her face, the elevator door now open behind her, ignored. Most of all, he watched his daughter. Chloe was holding buttons so tightly that the rabbit-stitched ear pressed against her cheek. Her lower lip trembled, but she did not cry. She lifted her chin in a way that broke her father's heart, because it was the way her mother had lifted her chin in the months when the hospital bills had been the loudest thing in the kitchen. Andrew leaned down once more, brushed a strand of hair off her cheek and said only, "Stand here with me, sweetheart. We are not the ones who are wrong this morning." Then he drew a slim leather envelope from inside his coat. It was plain, dark brown, with no monogram and no shine. He did not hand it to Corbin. He did not hand it to the receptionist. He looked across the lobby to Astrid, and when her eyes met his, he walked, slow and unhurried, to the assistant standing beside her, a young woman in a gray blazer with a name tag that read Hannah Riley. He placed the envelope in her hands. "Please give this to Miss Morgan," he said. "She will want to read the first 3 pages before anyone else speaks." Hannah, who had once been a paralegal before she had been an assistant to the chief executive, opened the envelope as her training told her to. Her face changed. She looked at Astrid. She looked at Andrew. She looked at the envelope again. Then she handed the documents to her supervisor with hands that had gone very still. Astrid read the first page. Her professional mask did not slip. She read the second page. A faint line appeared between her eyebrows. She read the third page. She lifted her eyes to Andrew, and in that moment something in the lobby changed temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. The document was an authenticated declaration of controlling ownership of Harrington Logistics, signed and notarized, registered with the state, accompanied by an instruction to call the chairman of the interim board for verification. There was also a single sealed page containing the names of every individual currently authorized to sign on behalf of the operations division, with their signing authority frozen pending an independent audit. Corbin Shaw's name was at the top. Astrid did not speak. She drew her phone from the pocket of her blazer, scrolled to a number she had used perhaps 4 times in her entire tenure, and pressed call. The lobby, which had been holding its breath, held it tighter. The interim chairman answered on the second ring. Astrid identified herself. She read 3 numbers from the bottom of the page. The voice on the other end said something brief that none of the others could hear, and Astrid lowered the phone slowly to her side. She turned to Corbin Shaw. Her voice was not loud. It carried because the room was already silent. "Mr. Shaw," she said, "you have just called the owner of this company a delivery man." For a long second, no one in the lobby moved. Corbin's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. The smirk that had ridden his face for 9 years tried to climb back into place and could not find a handhold. The young employee with the phone slipped it into his pocket. The senior manager who had nodded along stepped backward as if the floor had become hot. The receptionist almost involuntarily stood up. Andrew Cole did not smile. He did not press the moment. He looked at the lobby and said, in a voice meant only for those still capable of hearing, "I did not come here to find out who respects a rich man. I came here to find out who still respects a human being." The news traveled faster than the elevators. By the time Andrew and Astrid reached the 38th floor, every assistant on every floor knew that the man in the worn coat in the lobby was the controlling shareholder of Harrington Logistics. The few who had laughed at him began rehearsing apologies. One young employee tried to draft a message to a friend and found that his fingers could not remember how letters worked. The manager who had once forwarded an internal joke about lobby cleanup days deleted his sent folder. The security guard who had hesitated breathed out for what felt like the first time in 9 years. In the executive corridor, Hannah Riley opened a small private lounge for Chloe. There was a low table, a basket of crayons, a pitcher of warm apple cider, and a tray of plain biscuits. Hannah knelt down and asked Chloe what kind of pictures she liked to draw. Chloe considered her seriously and answered, "Houses where the lights are on." Hannah blinked, smiled gently, and brought out a fresh stack of paper. Andrew paused at the doorway and looked back at his daughter. Chloe set Button on the table with great care, smoothed his stitched ear, and asked without looking up, "Daddy, can you fix this?" Andrew thought about all the ways a man could fix a place, and how many of them were wrong. He answered, "I am not going to fix it by making other people afraid, sweetheart. I am going to fix it with the truth." Chloe nodded once. She picked up a yellow crayon. She started to draw. The boardroom on the 38th floor looked out over a Chicago that had not yet stopped raining. The long table was dark walnut. The chairs were leather, the lights soft. There was a screen at one end, a coffee service at the other, and 3 sealed binders waiting at each place, setting that no one in the room had asked for. Andrew Cole had placed those binders there the night before, with the help of 2 independent auditors and a senior partner from an outside law firm named Daniel Whitfield, who now entered the boardroom by video link with a sober good morning. Corbin Shaw entered last. 2 members of his inner circle came with him. They walked like men who had already decided to outsource the blame. Andrew gestured to the empty chairs without looking at them. Astrid took her usual seat at the head and folded her hands. The screen brightened. Andrew did not begin with anger. He began with paper. The first document was a payroll record. It showed 347 instances over the previous 18 months in which warehouse workers had been required to perform additional hours under the line item voluntary assistance, a phrase that, in the company handbook, was reserved for genuinely volunteer events such as the annual food drive. Underneath the spreadsheet was a stack of signed acknowledgement forms. Beneath the signed forms was a sworn statement from a shift supervisor, who described being instructed to move the schedules of any worker who refused to sign until the worker resigned out of exhaustion. The second document was a route log. On the night of January 15th, during a blizzard that had closed half the highways in Indiana, 3 drivers had been docked 4 hours of pay each for late delivery. The route log, pulled from the company's own satellite system, showed that all 3 trucks had been parked under state emergency orders. The drivers had been penalized for obeying the law. The third document was an insurance audit. It listed the names of 26 long-term employees whose family coverage had been reduced or canceled in the previous year. Beside each name was a copy of a form that the worker had supposedly signed to select a more flexible plan. The signatures were photocopies of older paperwork, lifted and reused. None of the workers had been informed. The fourth document was a record of a consulting fund called North Point Strategic Advisors. North Point had been retained by Harrington Logistics for advisory services at a rate of $120,000 a quarter. North Point had no employees, no website, no clients of its own, and a registered address that matched a vacant office above a dry cleaner in Schaumburg. Its sole shareholder, listed under a holding company, was a name that Astrid recognized at once. It was the maiden name of Corbin Shaw's wife. The fifth document was an internal email. Corbin had sent it 11 months earlier to 2 managers under his control. The message read in its entirety, "The turnover number is unacceptable. Adjust the reporting categories until the trend looks flat. We do not need accurate. We need presentable." The sixth document was an audio recording. Andrew did not play the whole file. He played 11 seconds. Corbin's voice came through the room cleanly. "Warehouse staff is replaceable. Make them sign. Anyone who refuses, move their shift until they quit on their own." The room did not breathe. The seventh and final exhibit was a photograph. It showed 3 men eating lunch in the corner of a refrigerated bay, seated on a pallet, their breath visible in the cold air. One of the men was Otis Dawson. He was holding a thermos in hands that shook gently from age and the chill. Andrew laid the photograph on the table and let it speak. Corbin tried, in the polished way of long-practiced men, to redirect. He spoke about market pressure, about quarterly competition, about the necessity of tough trade-offs. He looked at Astrid and called her by her first name, the way he had during the late-night meetings when she had been new and grateful. Astrid did not look back at him. Andrew waited until Corbin finished and then said, calmly, "Operations leadership did not need to hear every complaint. That is what you told the managers under you. That sentence is on the recording. That sentence is your defense. It is also your verdict." Daniel Whitfield on the screen confirmed that the documentation in front of the room was sufficient for an immediate suspension of Mr. Shaw's executive privileges, an immediate freeze on all financial and personnel approvals carrying his signature, and the transfer of the consulting fund records to outside forensic accountants. Astrid signed the suspension order without ceremony. Hannah revoked the building access. The 2 members of Corbin's inner circle who had walked in beside him discovered, suddenly, that they had urgent matters to attend to elsewhere. Corbin's polish cracked then. He turned to Astrid one last time and tried the only argument he had left. He told her that he had done all of it for her, for the company, for the survival of Harrington Logistics. He said the board would understand. He said she would understand once the shock had passed. Astrid finally looked at him. Her voice was even. "You did not protect this company, Mr. Shaw," she said. "You use it as a shield for your own appetite." 2 members of the building security team appeared at the boardroom doors. They did not raise their voices. Andrew lifted a hand and said, quietly, "Let him walk on his own." Justice does not need to mimic arrogance. Corbin Shaw walked out of the room with his head high and his eyes blank, the way a man walks when he is still trying to recover an image that no longer belongs to him. He passed through the lobby where, only a short while earlier, he had pointed a stranger toward the service entrance. The young employees who had once mirrored his every glance did not lift their eyes. The janitor stepped aside politely, as he had been trained to do, and then watched the polished shoes leave through the revolving door and into the gray rain. The janitor's expression did not change. He had been waiting for this morning for 9 years. In the days that followed, Andrew Cole did not act like a man who had won anything. He acted like a man who had a great deal of work to do. He ordered a full forensic audit of operations, human resources, finance, and payroll, with the results to be presented in open session to a reconstituted ethics committee. He suspended 4 mid-level managers known to have enforced Corbyn's directives. He opened an anonymous reporting line run by an independent third-party firm with no historic ties to Harrington. He required every executive at the vice presidential level and above to spend 1 full work week each year on the warehouse floor, riding routes with drivers, eating lunch in the staff break rooms, and listening without taking notes for the first 3 days. He did not, however, sweep through the building with a broom. He drew careful distinctions. The people who had actively designed the harm were removed. The people who had stayed silent out of fear were offered protection if they told the truth. The people who had been the targets of the harm were invited to come forward, and a fund was established to repay every dollar of unpaid overtime, every premium of canceled insurance, every shift earnings that had been quietly clipped. The repayments were calendared to be completed within 30 days. He reopened the warehouse staff break room that had been closed 8 months earlier under the budget line, Spatial Efficiency. There was no ribbon. There was no banner. Andrew carried the first table in himself, with the help of a 57-year-old forklift operator named Earl Wickham. Earl had nearly cried when he had heard the room was reopening. He did not cry now. He set his end of the table down carefully and said, "Mr. Cole, my back is not what it was." Andrew laughed for the first time in 2 days and said, "Mine either, Earl. Let us pretend together." Otis Dawson, the warehouse veteran who had been ordered out of the executive elevator, was offered a position as senior advisor to the new ethics committee. He shook Andrew's hand with both of his own, slowly, the way Andrew's wife's father had once shaken hands with the old founder. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, 38 years, sir. I thought I would leave in silence." Andrew met his eyes. "You are not leaving, Mr. Dawson. You are staying. The rest of us are going to listen." Astrid Morgan asked for the all-hands meeting herself. She did not allow her staff to prepare a polished slide deck. She stood at the front of the cafeteria, in a plain charcoal dress, without notes. She told the 800 employees gathered there, and the 4,000 more listening through a live company line, that she had believed in pretty charts more than she had believed in human beings. She said the words out loud. She did not soften them. She said that from that day forward, no report would carry weight in her office if it had been built on the silence of someone who had been hurt. A few people clapped. Many simply looked at her with the long patience of people who had been hurt before, and wanted to see whether words turned into months. She did not ask for applause. She nodded, stepped down, and walked back to her office without an entourage. That evening, after the building emptied, she found Andrew Cole in the corridor, near the small lounge where Chloe was still drawing. The two of them stood for a moment by the window. The rain had finally stopped, and the wet city outside reflected the long, warm lights of 1,000 buildings still working. Astrid was quiet for a while. Then she spoke without looking at him. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Cole," she said. "Not only for what happened in the lobby this morning, for 2 years. For trusting numbers more than I trusted the people who made them." Andrew turned the words over slowly before he answered. "A chief executive cannot hear every voice," he said at last. "But a chief executive can build a place where even the quietest voice is not afraid to speak. That is the only part you have to do well." She nodded. Something in her shoulders eased. Through the open door of the lounge, both of them could see Chloe, at the low table. The little girl had finished her picture. She held it up to herself in the way children do when they want to see if their hands have managed to keep a promise. The drawing showed a tall building. In front of the building stood a man in a dark coat. Around the man stood other people in work clothes, with simple round faces, all of them smiling. Above the building, the little girl had drawn a yellow sun. Below the picture she had written, in careful uneven letters, "Daddy fixes the sad place." Astrid stepped into the doorway. "May I look, sweetheart?" she asked. Chloe nodded. Astrid knelt next to her and studied the picture as if it were the most important document she had read all year. After a long moment she said, "It is a beautiful drawing." Chloe considered her seriously and said, "You can have it if you want." Astrid blinked once, took the picture and held it the way her grandmother had taught her to hold things that mattered. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to put it in my office, where I can see it every day." When Astrid stood up, Andrew was watching her with the same calm, steady gaze he had used in the lobby that morning. There was no triumph in it. There was only the careful respect of one person who had seen another person decide in real time to grow. The Cole family left the building at dusk. The rain had stopped completely. The lobby was busy with the soft motions of a workday ending. A maintenance worker waved at Chloe and pointed at her rabbit. She waved back shyly and held Button a little higher so he could see. Earl Wickham, on his way home from his shift, stopped Andrew at the revolving door and tipped his cap, and Andrew shook his hand with both of his own. Otis Dawson stood near the security desk, his thermos under his arm, and did not say anything. He simply nodded, and that was enough. Outside, the air smelled of clean concrete. Chloe looked up at her father as they walked toward the car. She was thinking, and her thinking made her face very serious. After half a block, she finally asked the question she had been carrying since the morning. "Daddy," she said, "tomorrow if we wear the same old coats, will they still laugh?" Andrew stopped on the sidewalk. He knelt in front of his daughter, the way he had knelt that morning, and he straightened the edge of her sleeve where it had bunched against her wrist. "Maybe some of them will, sweetheart," he said. "There will always be people who laugh at the wrong things. But kind people do not wait for someone else to become rich before they learn how to treat them with respect. The ones who waited until they learned who I was are still learning. The ones who never laughed at all are already further along." Chloe nodded, slow and solemn, the way she did when she had decided to keep something. She slipped her small hand back into his. They walked the rest of the way to the car in the quiet kind of silence that only fathers and daughters can hold. Inside the lobby behind them, Astrid Morgan stood at the tall window and watched them go. She looked down at the dress she was wearing, expensive and well cut, and then at the man in the worn charcoal coat walking away with a little girl and a stuffed rabbit. For the first time in her career, she understood that true power did not live in what a person wore. It lived in what a person chose to protect once they had any power at all. The most underestimated person in the room is sometimes the one who holds the signature that decides the future of every person who laughed. But the truly strong do not use that power to wound the ones who wounded them. The truly strong use it to make sure that no one else in that room, on any morning that follows, ever has to hear a child ask whether her clothes are the reason the grown-ups laugh.